Hello, my name is Dave Emory, and this is Side 1 of For the Record program number 726, The Kochtopus, The Tea Party Movement Manifests Classical Fascism. This program is being recorded on October 17th of the year 2010. The title of the program is a pun, obviously, on octopus, and it is playing with the title, with the last name, really, of a very, very powerful family, not as well known as they should be, and that is the Koch family, specifically the Koch brothers, Charles and David Koch. They, in turn, are the son of Fred Koch, one of the prime movers in the John Birch Society, and the Kochs have been instrumental in funding not only think tanks, but various forms of political expression that have been bringing to the fore, initially at least, a libertarian agenda. Indeed, David Koch was a big backer of the Libertarian Party in 1980. However, what it really is, the Koch agenda, the agenda being manifested by the Kochtopus, is one of corporatist thinking and outlook. Mussolini called fascism the corporate state, or corporatism. And what we're going to be looking at in this program is the extent to which the Tea Party movement is in many ways manifesting a classic fascist paradigm in which a grassroots/populist political movement is essentially bringing to the fore an ideological agenda which is against the best interests of the overwhelming majority of people who are operating at the grassroots. Indeed, we're going to be seeing how the Kochs, who are deeply involved in the fossil fuel, actually they're deeply involved in a lot of things, but the fossil fuels business, pipelines, and related enterprises are a big aspect of the Koch's enterprises, and they are, in turn, are major polluters, and they have a lot to say about the funding of cancer research, the classification of various chemicals as carcinogens or otherwise, and the more their agenda is able to be translated into physical reality and political reality, then ultimately the people who ingest, for example, those chemicals that are carcinogens but have been classified otherwise are going to eventually get cancer. Beyond that, the Kochs have been very active against every aspect of Obama's agenda, as well as any aspect of politics dating to the New Deal. And if, in fact, the Obama health care measure, for all of its shortcomings, is undone in part or in whole, then ultimately the people who get cancer from David Koch's enterprises are not going to get the medical care that they need. So when they're out stumping for the Kochtopus, and when they're out stumping for the Tea Party and saying things like, keep your government hands off of my Medicare, they in many ways are manifesting a classic corporatist agenda, a classic fascist agenda in which the brown or black-shirted masses are in fact putting into effect a political agenda that is against their best interests. What we're going to be doing in this program is accessing an article that many people are aware of. That is from the New Yorker magazine of August 30th of 2010. Jane Mayer authored an article titled Covert Operation, subtitled The Billionaire Brothers Who Are Waging a War Against Obama. The article's gotten a fair amount of circulation and a fair amount of gravitas, and I'm going to read the vast bulk of the article into the record. A few things I want to point out. In addition to the tremendous power of the Koch brothers, I also want to point out, first of all, their opposition to global warming, the Koch brothers' enterprises seizing upon the release of the East Anglia documents, leaked by WikiLeaks, by the way, which cast aspersions on global warming. I also want to note the opposition of the Koch forces to the Copenhagen Climate Conference on Global Warming. It was at that conference, or as an outgrowth of that Stephen Schneider, the Nobel Prize winner, began receiving death threats from neo-Nazis. He died of an apparent heart attack on a flight from Sweden to London. Also note the corporatist, explicitly corporatist philosophy that was near and dear to Fred Koch, the father of David and Charles. In fact, Fred Koch was an open admirer of Mussolini, and what his sons have done is to basically put Mussolini's philosophy into effect as an American, quote, reformist, unquote, political agenda. Again, the article is called Covert Operations by Jane Mayer from The New Yorker of August 30th of 2010. The article reads as follows. Skipping down, after discussing the Koch brothers and their presence, actually David Koch's presence at an event that was in basically to honor people who had supported Lincoln Center in New York, we read, one dignitary was conspicuously absent from the gala, the event's third honorary co-chair, Michelle Obama, the First Lady. Her office said that a scheduling conflict had prevented her from attending, yet had the First Lady shared the stage with Koch, it might have created an awkward tableau. In Washington, Koch is best known as part of a family that has repeatedly funded stealth attacks on the federal government and on the Obama administration in particular. With his brother Charles, who is 74, David Koch owns virtually all of Koch Industries, a conglomerate headquartered in Wichita, Kansas, whose annual revenues are estimated to be $100 billion. The company has grown spectacularly since their father Fred died in 1967 and the brothers took charge. The Kochs operate oil refineries in Alaska, Texas, and Minnesota and control some 4,000 miles of pipeline. Koch Industries owns Brawny Paper Towels, Dixie Cups, Georgia Pacific Lumber, Stainmaster Carpet, and Lycra, among other products. Forbes ranks it as the second largest private company in the country after Cargill, and its consistent profitability has made David and Charles Koch, who years ago bought out two other brothers, among the richest men in America. Their combined fortune of $35 billion is exceeded only by those of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. The Kochs are longtime libertarians who believe in drastically lower personal and corporate taxes, minimal social services for the needy, and much less oversight of industry, especially environmental regulation. These views dovetail with the brothers' corporate interests. In a study released this spring, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst's Political Economy Research Institute named Koch Industries one of the top 10 air polluters in the United States. And Greenpeace issued a report identifying the company as a, quote, kingpin of climate science denial, unquote. The report showed that from 2005 to 2008, the Kochs vastly outdid ExxonMobil in giving money to organizations fighting legislation related to climate change, underwriting a huge network of foundations, think tanks, and political front groups. Indeed, the brothers have funded opposition campaigns against so many Obama administration policies, from health care reform to the economic stimulus program, that in political circles, their ideological network is known as the Kochtopus. In a statement, Koch Industries said that the Greenpeace report distorts the environmental record of our companies, unquote, and David Koch, in a recent admiring article about him in New York Magazine, protested that the radical press, unquote, had turned his family into whipping boys, unquote, and had exaggerated its influence on American politics. But Charles Lewis, the founder of the Center for Public Integrity, a nonpartisan watchdog group, said, quote, the Kochs are on a whole different level. There's no one else who has spent this much money. The sheer dimension of it is what sets them apart. They have a pattern of law-breaking, political manipulation, and obfuscation. I've been in Washington since Watergate, and I've never seen anything like it. They are the Standard Oil of our times, unquote. A few weeks after the Lincoln Center Gala, the advocacy wing of the Americans for Prosperity Foundation, an organization that David Koch started in 2004, held a different kind of gathering. Now note here the profound puppet strings, purse strings really, running from the Kochtopus to the Tea Party movement are in evidence here. The Kochs are very secretive about to whom they give, and although David Koch has recently begun speaking out in favor of the Tea Party movement, they deny any direct connection, as does the Tea Party movement. That, simply put, is, shall we say, less than candid. Continuing, over the July 4th weekend, a summit called Texas Defending the American Dream took place in a chilly hotel ballroom in Austin. Though Koch freely promotes his philanthropic ventures, he did not attend the summit and his name was not in evidence. And on this occasion, the audience was roused not by a dance performance but by a series of speakers denouncing President Barack Obama. Peggy Venable, the organizer of the summit, warned that administration officials, quote, have a socialist vision for this country, unquote. 500 people attended the summit, which served in part as a training session for Tea Party activists in Texas. An advertisement cast the event as a populist uprising against vested corporate power. Note this, repeating this last sentence. An advertisement cast the event as a populist uprising against vested corporate power. Quote, today, the voices of average Americans are being drowned out by lobbyists and special interests, it said. Again quoting, but you can do something about it, unquote. The pitch made no mention of its corporate funders. The White House has expressed frustration that such sponsors have largely eluded public notice. David Axelrod, Obama's senior advisor, said, quote, what they don't say is that, in part, this is a grassroots citizen movement brought to you by a bunch of oil billionaires, unquote. In April of 2009, Melissa Colmia, a company spokesperson, denied that the Kochs had direct links to the Tea Party, saying that Americans for Prosperity is, quote, an independent organization and Koch companies do not in any way direct their activities, unquote. Later, she issued a statement, quote, no funding has been provided by Koch companies, the Koch foundations, or Charles Koch or David Koch specifically to support the Tea Parties, unquote. David Koch told New York, quote, I've never been to a Tea Party event. No one representing the Tea Party has ever even approached me, unquote. At the lectern in Austin, however, Venable, a longtime political operative who draws a salary from Americans for Prosperity, the Koch's foundation, and who has worked for Koch-funded political groups since 1994, spoke less warily, quote, we love what the Tea Parties are doing because that's how we're going to take back America, she declared as the crowd cheered. In a subsequent interview, she described herself as an early member of the movement, joking, quote, I was part of the Tea Party before it was cool, unquote. She explained that the role of Americans for Prosperity was to help, quote, educate, unquote, Tea Party activists on policy details and to give them next step training after their rallies so that their political energy could be channeled more effectively. And she noted that Americans for Prosperity had provided Tea Party activists with lists of elected officials to target. She said of the Kochs, quote, they're certainly our people. David's the chairman of our board. I've certainly met with him, and I'm very appreciative of what they do, unquote. Venable honored several Tea Party citizen leaders at the summit. The Texas branch of Americans for Prosperity gave its Blogger of the Year award to a young woman named Sybil West. On June 14th, West, writing on her site, described Obama as the, quote, cokehead-in-chief, unquote. In an online thread, West speculated that the president was exhibiting symptoms of, quote, demonic possession, a.k.a. schizophrenia, unquote. The summit featured several paid speakers, including Janine Turner, the actress best known for her role on the television series Northern Exposure. She declared, quote, they don't want our children to know about their rights. They don't want our children to know about a God, unquote. During a catered lunch, Venable introduced Ted Cruz, a former Solicitor General of Texas, who told the crowd that Obama was, quote, the most radical president ever to occupy the Oval Office, unquote, and had hidden from voters a secret agenda, quote, the government taking over our economy and our lives, unquote. Countering Obama, Cruz proclaimed was the epic fight of our generation, unquote. As the crowd rose to its feet and cheered, he quoted the defiant words of a Texan at the Alamo, victory or death, unquote. Americans for Prosperity has worked closely with the Tea Party since the movement's inception. In the weeks before the first Tax Day protests in April of 2009, Americans for Prosperity hosted a website offering supporters, quote, Tea Party talking points, unquote. Again, bear in mind that Americans for Prosperity is a Koch entity. Continuing, the Arizona branch urged people to send tea bags to Obama. The Missouri branch urged members to sign up for taxpayer Tea Party registration, unquote, and provided directions to non-protests. The group continues to stoke the rebellion. The North Carolina branch recently launched a Tea Party Finder website advertised as a hub for all the Tea Parties in North Carolina, unquote. The anti-government fervor infusing the 2010 elections represents a political triumph for the Kochs. By giving money to educate, unquote, fund and organize Tea Party protesters, they have helped turn their private agenda into a mass movement. Bruce Bartlett, a conservative economist and a historian who once worked for the National Center for Policy Analysis, a Dallas-based think tank that the Kochs fund, said, quote, "The problem with the whole libertarian movement is that it's been all chiefs and no Indians. There haven't been any actual people like voters who give an expletive deleted about it. So the problem for the Kochs has been trying to create a movement," unquote. With the emergence of the Tea Party, he said, everyone suddenly sees that for the first time there are Indians out there, people who can provide real ideological power, unquote. The Kochs, he said, are trying to shape and control and channel the populist uprising into their own policies, unquote. A Republican campaign consultant who has done research on behalf of Charles and David Koch said of the Tea Party, quote, "The Koch brothers gave the money that founded it. It's like they put the seeds in the ground. Then the rainstorm comes and the frogs come out of the mud and they're our candidates," unquote. The Kochs and their political operatives declined requests for interviews. Instead, a prominent New York public relations executive who is close with the Kochs put forward two friends, George Pataki, the former governor of New York, and Mortimer Zuckerman, the publisher and real estate magnate. Pataki, a Republican who received campaign donations from David Koch, called him a, quote, "patriot who cares deeply about his country," unquote. Zuckerman praised David's, quote, "gentle decency," unquote, and the range of his public interests, unquote. The Republican campaign consultant said of the family's political activities, quote, "to call them under the radar is an understatement. They are underground," unquote. Another former Koch advisor said, "They're smart. This right-wing redneck stuff works for them. They see this as a way to get things done without getting dirty themselves," unquote. Rob Stein, a Democratic political strategist who has studied the conservative movement's finances, says that the Kochs are, quote, "at the epicenter of the anti-Obama movement. But it's not just about Obama. They would have done the same to Hillary Clinton. They did the same to Bill Clinton. They are out to destroy progressivism." Oddly enough, the fiercely capitalist Koch owes part of its fortune to Joseph Stalin. Fred Koch was the son of a Dutch printer who settled in Texas and ran a weekly newspaper. Fred attended MIT, where he earned a degree in chemical engineering. In 1927, he invented a more efficient process for converting oil into gasoline, but according to family lore, America's major oil companies regarded him as a threat and shut him out of the industry. Unable to succeed at home, Koch found work in the Soviet Union. In the 1930s, his company trained Bolshevik engineers and helped Stalin's regime set up 15 modern oil refineries. Over time, however, Stalin brutally purged several of Koch's Soviet colleagues. Koch was deeply affected by the experience and regretted his collaboration. He returned to the United States. In the headquarters of his company, Rock Island Oil and Refining in Wichita, he kept photographs aimed at proving that some of those Soviet refineries had been destroyed in the Second World War. Gus DiZarega, a former friend of Charles Koch, recalled, quote, "as the Soviets became a stronger military power, Fred felt a certain amount of guilt at having helped them build up. I think it's bothered him a lot," unquote. Now next, the article goes into Fred Koch, the father of David and Charles, his participation in the John Birch Society. In a future broadcast, I think it may be time to review a little about the John Birch Society. It seems to be re-emerging into the public spotlight. It never went away, but it wasn't garnering a lot of press, but it seems to be getting more publicity and might be worth a show one of these days real soon. But in any event, Fred Koch was in fact a key John Birch Society activist, and he also was an admirer of Benito Mussolini, he of the corporatist philosophy. Returning to Jane Mayer's article, Covert Operations, in 1958, Fred Koch became one of the original members of the John Birch Society, the arch-conservative group known in part for a highly skeptical view of governance and for spreading fears of a communist takeover. Members considered President Dwight D. Eisenhower to be a communist agent. In a self-published broadside, Koch claimed that, quote, the communists have infiltrated both the Democratic and Republican parties, unquote. He wrote admiringly of Benito Mussolini's suppression of communists in Italy and disparagingly of the American civil rights movement. Quote, the colored man looms large in the communist plan to take over America, he warned. Welfare was a secret plot to attract rural blacks to cities where they would foment a, quote, vicious race war, unquote. In a 1963 speech that prefigures the Tea Party's talk of a secret socialist plot, Koch predicted that communists would, quote, infiltrate the highest offices of government in the U.S. until the president is a communist, unknown to the rest of us, unquote. There then is a discussion of the background of the Koch brothers, where they went to school and whom they married and so forth, and also of the struggles that the group has had, the family has had among its members. There was a bitter dispute over business matters among the brothers, and in fact, it was so intense that at the funeral of their mother, the two groups, the two factions of Koch brothers, did not speak to one another. So skipping down from that to the part that is relevant to all of us, what the Koch brothers are doing in a big way on the American political landscape, going back to the statements of Gus de Zarega, a friend of the Koch brothers. But de Zarega believes that the Koch brothers have followed a wayward intellectual trajectory, transferring their father's paranoia about Soviet communism to a distrust of the U.S. government and seeing its expansion beginning with the New Deal as a tyrannical threat to freedom. In an essay posted on BeliefNet, de Zarega writes, quote, as state socialism failed, the target for many within these organizations shifted to any kind of regulation at all. Socialism, unquote, kept being refined downwards, unquote. Members of the John Birch Society developed an interest in a school of Austrian economists who promoted free market ideals. Charles and David Koch were particularly influenced by the work of Friedrich von Hayek, the author of The Road to Serfdom, 1944, which argued that centralized government planning led inexorably to totalitarianism. Hayek's belief in unfettered capitalism has proved inspirational to many conservatives and to anti-Soviet dissidents as well. Lately, Tea Party supporters have championed his work. In June, the talk radio host Glenn Beck, who has supported the Tea Party rebellion, promoted the Road to Serfdom on his show. The paperback soon became a #1 bestseller on Amazon. Beck appears to be a fan of the Kochs. In the midst of a recent on-air parody of Al Gore, Beck said without explanation, I want to thank Charles Koch for this information, unquote. Beck declined to elaborate on the relationship. Charles and David also became devotees of a more radical thinker, Robert Lefevre, who favored the abolition of the state but didn't like the label anarchist. He called himself an autarkist. Lefevre liked to say that government is a disease masquerading as its own cure, unquote. In 1956, he opened an institution called the Freedom School in Colorado Springs. Brian Doherty of Reason magazine told me that, quote, Lefevre was an anarchist figure who won Charles's heart, unquote, and that the school was a tiny world of people who thought the New Deal was a horrible mistake, unquote. According to de Zarega, Charles supported the school financially and even gave him money to take classes there. Then more about the corporate struggles of the various brothers. Skipping down, as the fortunes grew, Charles and David Koch became the primary underwriters of hardline libertarian politics in America. Charles's goal, as Doherty described it, was to tear the government, quote, out at the root, unquote. The brothers' first major public step came in 1979 when Charles persuaded David, then 39, to run for public office. They had become supporters of the Libertarian Party and were backing its presidential candidate Ed Clark, who was running against Ronald Reagan from the right. Frustrated by the legal limits on campaign donations, they contrived to place David on the ticket in the vice presidential slot. Upon becoming a candidate, he could lavish as much of his personal fortune as he wished on the campaign. The ticket's slogan was, quote, "The Libertarian Party has only one source of funds, you," unquote. In fact, its primary source of funds was David Koch, who spent more than $2 million on the effort. Many of the ideas propounded in the 1980 campaign presaged the Tea Party movement. Ed Clark told The Nation magazine that libertarians were getting ready to stage, quote, "a very big Tea Party," unquote, because people were sick to death, unquote, of taxes. The Libertarian Party platform called for the abolition of the FBI and the CIA, as well as of federal regulatory agencies such as the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Energy. The party wanted to end Social Security, minimum wage laws, gun control, and all personal and corporate income taxes. It proposed the legalization of prostitution, recreational drugs, and suicide. Government should be reduced to only one function, the protection of individual rights. William F. Buckley, Jr., a more traditional conservative, called the movement anarcho-totalitarianism, unquote. That November, the Libertarian ticket received only 1% of the vote. The brothers realized that their brand of politics didn't sell at the ballot box. Charles Koch became openly scornful of conventional politics. Quote, "It tends to be a nasty, corrupting business," he told a reporter at the time. "I'm interested in advancing libertarian ideas," unquote. According to Doherty's book, the Kochs came to regard elected politicians as merely, quote, "actors playing out a script," unquote. A longtime confidant of the Kochs told Doherty that the brothers wanted to, quote, "supply the themes and words for the scripts," unquote. In order to alter the direction of America, they had to, quote, "influence the areas where policy ideas percolate from, academia, and the think tanks," unquote. After the 1980 election, Charles and David Koch receded from the public arena, but they poured more than $100 million into dozens of seemingly independent organizations. Tax records indicated that in 2008, the three main Koch family foundations gave money to 34 political and policy organizations, 3 of which they founded and several of which they direct. The Kochs and their company have given additional millions to political campaigns, advocacy groups, and lobbyists. The family's subterranean financial role has fueled suspicion on the left. Lee Fang of the liberal blog Think Progress has called the Kochs, quote, "the billionaires behind the hate," unquote. We're going to continue with this article from the New Yorker magazine of August 30th of 2010 in Side 2 of the program. In order to flesh out your understanding of the subject material, in particular in order to get a better grasp of what I mean when I talk about classical fascism or corporatism or the corporate state, as Mussolini called it, check out SpitfireList.com, the best source for information of this kind. There's also a page to click on in order to support the work that I'm doing. And if you don't like what you see, there's no better way of fighting back than supporting the work that I'm doing, because sadly, it's the Kochs funding the other side. I just haven't got that kind of resources. We're going to plunge right in where we left off at the end of Side 1. I have been reading into the record the vast bulk of an article from the New Yorker magazine of August 30th of 2010. The article has received a fair amount of publicity, happily, and a fair amount of circulation. However, I thought for those of you who have not read it yourselves or have not heard about it, I thought it might be worth going into at length and in detail. The article is called Covert Operations. Again, it's by Jane Mayer. It's from the New Yorker magazine of August 30th of 2010. It's about the Koch brothers, Charles and David Koch, the son of John Birch Society kingpin Fred Koch, And it basically is about how the Kochs are funding the institutions which are providing the Tea Parties with their ideological agenda. And that ideological agenda is basically a corporatist ideological agenda, which obviously is consistent with and benefits the Koch brothers' enormous business operations. But as we're going to see, their translation of their corporatist philosophy into a grassroots movement is not only a classic manifestation of the paradigm of traditional fascism, or corporatism as Mussolini called it, but it really represents a fundamental perversion of political ideology, because the people who are supporting this movement at the grassroots level are the people who ultimately are going to get crushed when these corporatist philosophies bear fruit. Just witness what happened when the Reagan and Bush years finally bore the fruit that many people had been warning they must, namely the deregulation that produced the 2008 financial collapse. Well, if you like that, there is an old military slang acronym called BOHICA. It's an abbreviation for bend over, here it comes again. And it's coming courtesy of the Kochs. Turning once again to this article from the New Yorker magazine, and after the 1980 election, when their Libertarian Party essentially went no place, only the Kochs know precisely how much they spent on politics. Public records show that between 1998 and 2008, the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation spent more than $48 million. The Claude R. Lamb Charitable Foundation, which is controlled by Charles Koch and his wife, along with 2 company employees and an accountant, spent more than $28 million. The David H. Koch Charitable Foundation spent more than $120 million. Meanwhile, since 1998, Koch Industries has spent more than $50 million on lobbying. Separately, the company's Political Action Committee, KochPAC, has donated some $8 million to political campaigns, more than 80% of it to Republicans. So far in 2010, Koch Industries leads all other energy companies in political contributions, as it has since 2006. In addition, during the dozen years, the Kochs and other family members have personally spent more than $2 million on political contributions. In the second quarter of 2010, David Koch was the biggest individual contributor to the Republican Governors Association with a $1 million donation. Other gifts by the Kochs may be untraceable. Federal tax law permits anonymous personal donations to politically active nonprofit groups. In recent decades, members of several industrial dynasties have spent parts of their fortunes on a conservative agenda. In the 1980s, the Olin family, which owns a chemicals and manufacturing conglomerate, became known for funding right-leaning thinking in academia, particularly in law schools. And during the 90s, Richard Mellon Scaife, a descendant of Andrew Mellon, spent millions attempting to discredit Bill Clinton. Ari Rabin-Havt, a vice president at the Democratic-leaning website Media Matters, said that the Koch's effort is unusual in its marshaling of corporate and personal funds. Quote, "Their role in terms of financial commitments is staggering," unquote. Of course, Democrats give money, too. Their most prominent donor, the financier George Soros, runs a foundation, the Open Society Institute, that has spent as much as $100 million a year in America. Soros has also made generous private contributions to various Democratic campaigns, including Obama's. But Michael Vachon, his spokesman, argued that Soros' giving is transparent and that, quote, "none of his contributions are in the service of his own economic interests," unquote. The Kochs, by contrast, have given millions of dollars to nonprofit groups that criticize environmental regulation and support lower taxes for industry. Gusty Zarega, the former friend, suggested that the Kochs' youthful idealism about libertarianism had largely devolved into a rationale for corporate self-interest. He said of Charles, quote, "Perhaps he has confused making money with freedom," unquote. Some critics have suggested that the Kochs' approach has subverted the purpose of tax-exempt giving. By law, charitable foundations must conduct exclusively nonpartisan activities that promote the public welfare. A 2004 report by the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, a watchdog group, described the Koch foundations as being self-serving, concluding, quote, "These foundations give money to nonprofit organizations that do research and advocacy on issues that impact the profit margin of Koch Industries," unquote. The Kochs have gone well beyond their immediate self-interest, however, funding organizations that aim to push the country in a libertarian direction. Among the institutions that they have subsidized are the Institute for Justice, which files lawsuits opposing state and federal regulations, the Institute for Humane Studies, which underwrites libertarian academics, and the Bill of Rights Institute, which promotes a conservative slant on the Constitution. Many of the organizations funded by the Kochs employ specialists who write position papers that are subsequently quoted by politicians and pundits. David Koch has acknowledged that the family exerts tight ideological control. Quote, "If we're going to give a lot of money, we'll make darn sure they spend it in a way that goes along with our intent," he told Doherty. "And if they make a wrong turn and start doing things we don't agree with, we withdraw funding," unquote. The Koch subsidization of a pro-corporate movement fulfills in many ways the vision laid out in a secret 1971 memo that Lewis Powell, then a Virginia attorney, wrote 2 months before he was nominated to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. The anti-war movement, by the way, for younger listeners, that's the anti-Vietnam War movement. The anti-war movement had turned its anger on defense contractors such as Dow Chemical, and Ralph Nader was leading a public interest crusade against corporations. Powell, writing a report for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, urged American companies to fight back. The greatest threat to free enterprise, he warned, was not communism or the New Left, but rather, quote, "respectable elements of society, intellectuals, journalists, and scientists. To defeat them," he wrote, "business leaders needed to wage a long-term, unified campaign to change public opinion." Charles Koch seems to have approached both business and politics with the deliberation of an engineer. To bring about social change, he told Doherty, requires a strategy, unquote, that is vertically and horizontally integrated, unquote, spanning from idea to creation to public policy development to education to grassroots organizations to lobbying to litigation to political action, unquote. The project, he admitted, was extremely ambitious. "We have a radical philosophy," he said. In 1977, the Kochs provided the funds to launch the nation's first libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute. According to the Center for Public Integrity, between 1986 and 1993, the Koch family gave $11 million to the Institute. Today, Cato has more than 100 full-time employees, and its experts and policy papers are widely quoted and respected by the mainstream media. It describes itself as nonpartisan, and its scholars have at times been critical of both parties, but it has consistently pushed for corporate tax cuts, reductions in social services, and laissez-faire environmental policies. When President Obama, in a 2008 speech, described the science on global warming as beyond dispute, unquote, the Cato Institute took out a full-page ad in the Times to contradict him. Cato's resident scholars have relentlessly criticized political attempts to stop global warming as expensive, ineffective, and unnecessary. Ed Crane, the Cato Institute's founder and president, told me that, quote, "global warming theories give the government more control of the economy," unquote. Cato scholars have been particularly energetic in promoting the ClimateGate scandal. Last year, private emails of climate scientists at the University of East Anglia in England were mysteriously leaked, and their exchanges appeared to suggest a willingness to falsify data in order to buttress the idea that global warming is real. In the 2 weeks after the emails went public, one Cato scholar gave more than 20 media interviews trumpeting the alleged scandal. But 5 independent inquiries since exonerated the researchers, and nothing was found in their emails or data to discredit the scientific consensus on global warming. Bear in mind that leak was from WikiLeaks, who we spent 2 programs about. Continuing. Nevertheless, the controversy succeeded in spreading skepticism about climate change. even though the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration recently issued a report concluding that the evidence for global warming is unequivocal, more Americans are convinced than at any time since 1997 that scientists have exaggerated the seriousness of global warming. The Kochs promote this statistic on their company's website, but do not mention the role that their funding has played in fostering such doubt. In a 2002 memo, the Republican political consultant Frank Luntz wrote that so long as, quote, voters believe there is no consensus about global warming within the scientific community, the status quo would prevail. The key for opponents of environmental reform, he said, was to question the science, a public relations strategy that the tobacco industry has effectively used for years to forestall regulation. The Kochs have funded many sources of environmental skepticism, such as the Heritage Foundation, which has argued that, quote, scientific facts gathered in the past 10 years do not support the notion of catastrophic human-made warming, unquote. The brothers have given money to more obscure groups, too, such as the Independent Women's Forum, which opposes the presentation of global warming as a scientific fact in American public schools. Until 2008, that group was run by Nancy Pfotenhauer, a former lobbyist for Koch Industries. Mary Beth Jarvis, a vice president of a Koch subsidiary, is on the group's board. Naomi Oreskes, a professor of history and science studies at the University of California, San Diego, is the co-author of Merchants of Doubt, a new book that chronicles various attempts by American industry to manipulate public opinion on science. She noted that the Kochs, as the heads of a company with refineries and pipelines, have a lot at stake, unquote. She added, again quoting, if the answer is to phase out fossil fuels, a different group of people are going to be making money, so we shouldn't be surprised that they're fighting tooth and nail, unquote. David Koch told New York that he was unconvinced that global warming has been caused by human activity. Even if it has been, he said, the heating of the planet will be beneficial, resulting in longer growing seasons in the northern hemisphere. Quote, the Earth will be able to support enormously more people because far greater land area will be available to produce food, he said. In the mid-1980s, the Kochs provided millions of dollars to George Mason University in Arlington, Virginia, to set up yet another think tank. Now known as the Mercatus Center, it promotes itself as the world's premier university source for market-oriented ideas, bridging the gap between academic ideas and real-world problems, unquote. Financial records show that the Koch family foundations have contributed more than $30 million to George Mason, much of which has gone to the Mercatus Center, a nonprofit organization. Quote, it's ground zero for deregulation policy in Washington, Rob Stein, the Democratic strategist, said. It is an unusual arrangement. Quote, George Mason is a public university and receives public funds, Stein noted. Virginia is hosting an institution that the Kochs practically control. The founder of the Mercatus Center is Richard Fink, formerly an economist. Fink heads Koch Industries' lobbying operation in Washington. In addition, he is the president of the Charles G. Koch Charitable Foundation, the president of the Claude R. Lamb Charitable Foundation, a director of the Fred C. and Mary R. Koch Foundation, and a director and co-founder with David Koch of the Americans for Prosperity Foundation. Fink, with his many titles, has become the central nervous system of the Kochtopus. He appears to have supplanted Ed Crane, the head of the Cato Institute, as the brothers' main political lieutenant. Though David remains on the board at Cato, Charles Koch has fallen out with Crane. Associates suggested to me that Crane had been insufficiently respectful of Charles's management philosophy, which he distilled into a book called The Science of Success and trademarked under the name Market-Based Management, or MBM. In the book, Charles recommends instilling a company's corporate culture with the competitiveness of the marketplace. Koch describes MBM as a holistic system containing, quote, 5 dimensions: vision, virtue and talents, knowledge processes, decision rights, and incentives, unquote. A top Cato Institute official told me that Charles, quote, thinks he's a genius, unquote. He's the emperor, and he's convinced he's wearing clothes, unquote. Fink, by contrast, has been far more embracing of Charles's ideas. Fink, like the Kochs, declined to be interviewed. At a 1995 conference for philanthropists, Fink adopted the language of economics when speaking about the Mercatus Center's purpose. He said that grant makers should use think tanks and political action groups to convert intellectual raw materials into policy products, unquote. The Wall Street Journal has called the Mercatus Center, quote, the most important think tank you've never heard of, and notes that 14 of the 23 regulations that President George W. Bush placed on a hit list had been first suggested by Mercatus scholars. Fink told the paper that the Kochs have, quote, other means of fighting their battles, unquote, and that the Mercatus Center does not actively promote the company's private interests. But Thomas McGarity, a law professor at the University of Texas who specializes in environmental issues, told me that, quote, Koch has been constantly in trouble with the EPA, and Mercatus has constantly hammered on the agency, unquote. An environmental lawyer who has clashed with the Mercatus Center called it, quote, a means of laundering economic aims, unquote. The lawyer explained the strategy, quote, you take corporate money and give it to a neutral-sounding think tank which, quote, hires people with pedigrees and academic degrees who put out credible-seeming studies, but they all coincide perfectly with the economic interests of their funders, unquote. In 1997, for instance, the EPA moved to reduce surface ozone, a form of pollution caused in part by emissions from oil refineries. Susan Dudley, an economist who became a top official at the Mercatus Center, criticized the proposed rule. The EPA, she argued, had not taken into account that smog-free skies would result in more cases of skin cancer. She projected that if pollution were controlled, it would cause up to 11,000 additional cases of skin cancer each year. In 1999, the District of Columbia Circuit Court took up Dudley's smog argument. Evaluating the EPA rule, the court found that the EPA had, quote, explicitly disregarded the possible health benefits of ozone, unquote. In another part of the opinion, the court ruled 2-1 that the EPA had overstepped its authority in calibrating standards for ozone emissions. As the Constitutional Accountability Center, a think tank, revealed, the judges in the majority had previously attended legal junkets on a Montana ranch that were arranged by the Foundation for Research on Economics and the Environment, a group funded by Koch family foundations. The judges have claimed that the ruling was unaffected by their attendance. Ideas don't happen on their own, Matt Kibbe, the president of Freedom Works, a Tea Party advocacy group, told me. Throughout history, ideas need patrons, unquote. The Koch brothers, after helping to create Cato and Mercatus, concluded that think tanks alone were not enough to effect change. They needed a mechanism to deliver those ideas to the street and to attract the public's support. In 1984, David Koch and Richard Fink created yet another organization, and Kibbe joined them. The group, Citizens for a Sound Economy, seemed like a grassroots movement, but according to the Center for Public Integrity, it was sponsored principally by the Kochs, who provided $7.9 million between 1986 and 1993. Its mission, Kibbe said, was to take these heavy ideas and translate them for mass America. We read the same literature Obama did about nonviolent revolutions, Saul Alinsky, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. We studied the ideas of the Boston Tea Party as an example of nonviolent social change. We learned we needed boots on the ground to sell ideas, not candidates, unquote. Within a few years, the group had mobilized 50 paid field workers in 26 states to rally voters behind the Koch's agenda. David and Charles, according to one participant, were very controlling, very top-down. You can't build an organization with them because they run it, unquote. Around this time, the brothers faced a political crisis. In 1989, the Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs investigated their business and released a scathing report accusing Koch Oil of, quote, a widespread and sophisticated scheme to steal crude oil from Indians and others through fraudulent mismeasuring, unquote. The Kochs admitted that they had improperly taken $31 million worth of crude oil, but said that it had been accidental. Charles Koch told committee investigators that oil measurement is, quote, a very uncertain art, unquote. To defend its reputation, Koch Industries hired Robert Strauss, then a premier Washington lobbyist. The company soon opened an office in the city. A grand jury was convened to investigate the allegations, but it eventually disbanded without issuing any criminal charges. According to the Senate report, after the committee hearings, Koch operatives delved into the personal lives of committee staffers, even questioning an ex-wife. Senate investigators were upset by the Koch's tactics. Kenneth Bolland, the counsel to the Senate committee, said, quote, "These people have amassed such unaccountable power," unquote. By 1993, when Bill Clinton became president, Citizens for a Sound Economy had become a prototype for the kind of corporate-backed opposition campaigns that had proliferated during the Obama era. The group waged a successful assault on Clinton's proposed BTU tax on energy, for instance, running advertisements, staging media events, and targeting opponents. And it mobilized anti-tax rallies outside the Capitol, rallies that NPR described as, quote, "designed to strike fear into the hearts of wavering Democrats," unquote. Dan Glickman, a former Democratic congressman from Wichita who supported the BTU tax, recalled, quote, "I'd been in Congress 18 years. The Kochs actually engaged against me and funded my opponent. They used a lot of resources and effort, their employees too," unquote. Glickman suffered a surprise defeat. "I can't prove it, but I think I was probably their victim," he said. The Kochs continued to disperse their money, creating slippery organizations with generic-sounding names, and this made it difficult to ascertain the extent of their influence in Washington. In 1990, Citizens for a Sound Economy created a spin-off group, Citizens for the Environment, which called acid rain and other environmental problems myths, unquote. When the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette investigated the matter, it discovered that the spin-off group had no citizen membership of its own, unquote. In 1997, another Senate investigation began looking into what a minority report called, quote, "an audacious plan to pour millions of dollars in contributions into Republican campaigns nationwide without disclosing the amount or the source in order to evade campaign finance laws." A shell corporation, Triad Management, had paid more than $3 million for attack ads in 26 House races and 3 Senate races. More than half of the advertising money came from an obscure nonprofit group, the Economic Education Trust. The Senate committee's minority report suggested that the, quote, "trust was financed in whole or in part by Charles and David Koch of Wichita, Kansas," unquote. The brothers were suspected of having secretly paid for the attack ads, most of which aired in states where Koch Industries did business. In Kansas, where Triad Management was especially active, the funds may have played a decisive role in 4 of 6 federal races. The Kochs, when asked by reporters if they had given the money, refused to comment. In 1998, however, the Wall Street Journal confirmed that a consultant on the Kochs' payroll had been involved in the scheme. Charles Lewis of the Center for Public Integrity described the scandal as historic. Triad was the first time a major corporation used a cutout, a front operation, in a threatening way. Koch Industries was the poster child of a company run amok, unquote. During the Clinton administration, the energy industry faced increasing scrutiny and regulation. In the mid-90s, the Justice Department filed 2 lawsuits against Koch Industries, claiming that it was responsible for more than 300 oil spills, which had released an estimated 3 million gallons of oil into lakes and rivers. The penalty was potentially as high as $214 million. In a settlement, Koch Industries paid a record $30 million civil fine and agreed to spend $5 million on environmental projects. In 1999, a jury found Koch Industries guilty of negligence and malice in the deaths of 2 Texas teenagers in an explosion that resulted from a leaky underground butane pipeline. In 2001, the company paid an undisclosed settlement. And in the final months of the Clinton presidency, the Justice Department leveled a 97-count indictment against the company for covering up the discharge of 91 tons of benzene, a carcinogen, from the refinery in Corpus Christi, Texas. The company was liable for $350 million in fines, and 4 Koch employees faced up to 35 years in prison. The Koch Petroleum Group eventually pleaded guilty to a $1 million fine. David Ullman, a career prosecutor who at the time headed the environmental crimes section at the Justice Department, described the suit as, quote, one of the most significant cases ever brought under the Clean Air Act, unquote. He added, again quoting, environmental crimes are almost always motivated by economics and arrogance, and in the Koch case, there was a healthy dose of both, unquote. During the 2000 election campaign, Koch Industries spent some $900,000 to support the candidacies of George W. Bush and other Republicans. During the Bush years, Koch Industry and other fossil fuel companies enjoyed remarkable prosperity. The 2005 energy bill, which Hillary Clinton dubbed the Dick Cheney lobbyist energy bill, offered enormous subsidies and tax breaks for energy companies. The Kochs have cast themselves as deficit hawks, but according to a study by Media Matters, their companies have benefited from nearly $100 million in government contracts since 2000. In 2004, Citizens for a Sound Economy was accused of illegitimately throwing its weight behind Bush's re-election. The group's Oregon branch had attempted to get Ralph Nader on the presidential ballot in order to dilute Democratic support for John Kerry. Critics argued that it was illegal for a tax-exempt non-profit organization to donate its services for partisan political purposes. A complaint was filed with the Federal Election Commission. It was dismissed. And the article goes on to describe just how persevering the Kochs have been. Grover Norquist, who holds a weekly meeting for conservative leaders in Washington, including representatives from Americans for Prosperity, told me that last summer's raucous rallies were pivotal in undermining Obama's agenda. Skipping down. When Obama was strong, the Chamber of Commerce said we can work with the Obama administration. But that changed when thousands of people went into the street and terrorized congressmen. August is what changed it. Now that Obama is weak, people are getting tough, unquote. And of the Koch brothers, Jane Mayer goes on to say, the Koch's sense of imperilment is somewhat puzzling. Income inequality in America is greater than it has been since the 1920s, and since the 70s, the tax rates of the wealthiest have fallen more than those of the middle class. Yet, the brothers' message has evidently resonated with voters. A recent poll found that 55% of Americans agreed that Obama is a socialist. And so again, with these grassroots people out there implementing a corporatist agenda, the Kochtopus and the Tea Party is manifesting a classic fascist paradigm. This concludes Side 2 of For the Record program number 726, The Kochtopus, the Tea Party Movement Manifests Classical Fascism. This is being recorded on October 17th of the year 2010. My name's Dave Emory. Thanks for listening.
And that's